As you know, on Sunday night or Monday morning of every week, we post a new expository semiotics explaining why we would choose which lectionary readings. But in these readings, our dream is and our desire is to help you read the signs and fondle the details and spot the seminal metaphors, the condensed signs and the stories that are key for preaching to a digital culture. So strap on your seatbelt and join us as we prospect our passages for today. Welcome to LenTalk number 124. The lectionary passages that we're going to be looking at are from the 7th of August, 2022. I'm going to really just focus on the gospel passage, the Luke passage. I'm going to read it in a minute, but I want to just begin by thanking you for being a part of this journey with me. We've been now for over 2 years, and every week I post a LenTalk on YouTube, and I use the lectionary passages as springboards for reflections and ruminations and some critical reviews of what's going on in the world of biblical scholarship and the world of semiotics. And let me just say, this is I'm taping this on the 31st of July. And this is a big day in my own autobiography. And I celebrated it yesterday by taking the family to the Space Needle in Seattle. The 31st of July is George Jetson's birthday. And the Jetsons was set in 2062, which is 100 years after the building and opening of the space age Space Needle in 1962 as part of the 1962 World's Fair that took place in Seattle, and the theme was the city of tomorrow. So I just celebrate. I don't celebrate natal days rarely, because the early Christians celebrated their birthday, the birthday of the saints and their ancestors, on their death day, because that was really their birthday into eternity. The paradox: the moment you're born, you begin to die. The moment you die, you live forever. You begin to live forever. And so when we celebrate a Saint's Day, we're celebrating that person's birthday into eternity, not the birthday in which they were born. So George Jetson, 31st of July, when I'm taping this, happy birthday. And I celebrate your birthday by going all the way up the Space Needle and revisiting its construction. I also just want to begin, but there's some things that just make no sense, and you just got to live with them. You just can't. Now, some things make no sense, and you try not to live with them, and you try and change them. But there's some things that just make no sense, and you just shake your head and have to live with it. For example, we call the planet that we live on planet Earth. Earth, ground, dirt, soil. But 70% of this planet is water. It's ocean. It's lakes. It's either freshwater, saltwater. But over 2/3 of the planet is not Earth. 2/3 of the planet is water. Why don't we call it planet water, or planet aqua, or planet ocean? What is this planet Earth thing going on? And we are created. God mixes earth and water, and takes this clump of clay and molds it and fashions it into God's image. So I'm just gonna, every now and then I call it planet water, but everybody looks at me like I've just parked my spaceship outside the door. But so you just live with that. Other things don't make you're reminded of, and you can do a little bit about. And I was finishing this book. It's called English Garden Eccentrics. And I want to see what the imagination created in the past in terms of gardens. And basically, I was very disappointed in this book because all you got basically was topiaries, different kinds of topiaries. These are sculpted bushes and shrubs and yew trees and other things. And but what really, it was almost worth the whole price of the book. After seeing this, you got 300 and some pages of commentary and pictures on some of the greatest English gardens the last couple of centuries. It comes to this concluding coda here. Yeah. And it says the present status of the gardens that I've been reading about and studying in this book. Here's one. The early gardens were dismantled soon after Tyre's death in 1767. The house has been much modernized, but much of the estate has been given over to vineyards and is currently run by a winery. In other words, nothing's left of the garden. Here's another one. Let's see. The present status of the gardens. Largely destroyed, known primarily through archaeological remains. Here's another one. The garden has vanished. Here's another one. This is the Hermitage Garden, which I was most interested in. The garden no longer exists. Here's another one, the Hoole House in Cheshire. Hoole House and gardens, all traces have vanished. Here's another one. I mean, I could go on and on here. A couple of them survive, but over and over again, that the house has been replaced with an early 20th century red brick dwelling. Much of the garden has been covered with development. Here's another one. The house was pulled down in 1907. The garden has been redeveloped and is unrecognizable. I mean, I could go on and on here. And I'm looking at that fortunes were spent. Because back then you competed with one another for who had the best garden. Of course, a top of the line garden would always have a hermit, and that's a whole other story. Every prestigious garden would have a hermit. It was a profession that you actually applied for, and you signed a contract, most of them for 5 to 7 years. And every garden had their hermit. And hermit's job was just to walk the garden and to be eccentric and grow a long beard. Sometimes you just determine how long the fingernails would grow. And that was all signed. And how do you want your food? Do you want it under the door? Do you want to talk to people to bring it to you? But basically, the hermit basically just walked the garden and read books. So any of you tempted to wonder when would have been a good time to leave, if you love reading, would have been a good time to live, it might have been back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century with these incredible gardens. But I'm reading about all this time and attention and just effort expended. And I want beautiful gardens, but there's something that we got to remember, and this is what's so easy to forget. And C.T. Studd, who was a British missiologist, a colleague of Hudson Taylor in China, and one of my favorite people for aphorisms. He had something that this is not my favorite aphorism. My favorite aphorism of C.T. Studd is, some wish to live near sound of chapel and bell. I want to run a rescue house within a yard of hell. I love that. But he wrote something that it really, as I was reading this book and came to that section at the very end, that concluding coda, whatever happened to all these gardens that you've been looking at and reading about. Soon this life will still be past. only what's done for Christ will last. Soon this life 'twill be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Yes, create beautiful gardens. Yes, create a place of hospitality for people. But remember that what lasts is what's done for Christ in those garden spaces, in those hospitality places. That's what is going to last. And the third thing that I just don't get, and this is something though that we can do something about. And I basically spent my ministry trying to do something about it. And I want to look at the Luke text and read it to you and then reflect on it, because we're going to be dealing today in this LenTalk with the role of doctrine in faith and the association of faith equals doctrine or belief equals creed is one that I have been trying to deal with all my life and untangle and clarify. And so I'm just going to read to you. These are Jesus's words in the Gospel according to Dr. Luke. This is chapter 12, verses 32 to 40. I love the tenderness by which Jesus speaks here. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Isn't that beautiful? It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Now, notice the kingdom is not something you work for and earn and build yourself. It's a gift. It's a gift of grace. Sell your possessions, give alms, make purses for yourselves that do not wear out. An unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those servants. Now, Jesus has this metaphor that he uses of wedding. And the 10 bridesmaids is another place. So he obviously, whether this is a shorthand, succinct description of that other parable of the 10 bridesmaids, I call it the 10 bridesmaids, 5 of which were strategic planners, 5 of which were scouts with the motto of be prepared. 5 trimmed their wicks accordingly. In other words, they stuck to the plan. 5 says, we just gotta, nobody knows. We just gotta be prepared for it and be fast off our feet and strong on our feet, so that when the bridegroom comes, we're ready. Whether it's 2 separate stories or Jesus just, this is a favorite metaphor. It becomes the primary metaphor for how, in Paul, the body of Christ, the bride of Christ, how you run the church. How is the church to be governed? How is the church to be administered? Ministered. And we have, notice, this is the primary metaphor on which words are based, by which we are to think of the church and our relationship to the church and our relationship to each other. The church is not a monarchy. It is not a theocracy. It is not a democracy. It is not a tyranny. The church is at base a matrimony. It's not majority rules runs the church. Every time the majority rule ruled in the Bible, they ruled wrong. The biggest majority rules in history: kill Jesus, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus was killed by majority rule. How do you govern and administer the church? And the metaphor that is used is matrimony. It is how you manage the church, and it is so important to understand this, because, I mean, by and large, we have sold the matrimonial component for the St. Robert's Rules of Order, rather than St. Paul's Rules of the Spirit, or Rules of Relationship. Because if there's one thing anybody who is in a matrimonial situation knows, a marriage is all about relationship. And the paradigmatic model for the church in the New Testament is not democracy. It is not monarchy. It is not bureaucracy. It is not a nation state. It is a matrimony. A matrimony meaning a mutuality of relationships. And this is the mystical body of Christ, which is the bride of Christ. What does it mean to learn to be the bride of Christ? Which means, what does it mean to learn to be in relationship? It's all about relationship. Now, so you got Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order is all about bureaucracy. We also can order the church according to doctrine, to creedal formulas. And I want to say a word for doctrine and principles and propositions, as I argue that it's this relational component, this relational matrix, out of which we are called to be in relationship with the church, with each other, with life itself. But that does not mean that propositions and creeds and doctrines aren't important. Now, I'm going to give you some metaphors on how I look at doctrine. Each one of them is flawed in some way. So these are not perfect metaphors or perfect examples. But let me just give you each one. Instead of dealing with the flaws, let me just put them out there. Maybe they'll be helpful to you in thinking about the relationship between faith and doctrine. Every building needs a foundation. But the foundation is not the purpose of the building. The building is not built for that foundation. And you don't spend all your time living in that foundation and celebrating that foundation and touring that foundation and learning that foundation. Truth needs foundational propositions and points. I mean, for me to say God is love, it's itself a proposition, okay? You can't escape it. And that's a foundation one. But the propositions are not the purpose of the truth. Only its foundation on which you build the whole building, the whole life. Let me give you another metaphor. Now, there are real severe problems with that one. But it's a good way to begin to think about the role of foundations and propositions in the life of faith, needing a strong foundation, but you don't stay there. In fact, the better the foundation, the more you can forget about them and live in the building. Doctrines are steps in a staircase to greater intimacy with God. They are not a series of diktats, of requirements, of duties. There's a certain, as you're climbing the staircase, and there's a certain lightness of step, and they're not the ponderous and weighty boots on the ground kinds of things that we've made our are propositions. Another metaphor, I spent most of my life in places there are a lot of bridges. Manhattan area, Seattle area, Portland area, there's a lot of bridges. And for me, doctrines are like the guardrails and the scaffolding on the side of a bridge. I have no problem going over a bridge. I'll go over a bridge 70, 80 miles an hour. No problem. I have no fear of bridges. No matter how high they are, no matter how undulating they are, I'm fine. But you take off the guardrails. You take off the sides of the bridge. So there's just a total open invitation to the water with nothing to hold you back, nothing to keep you on the road if you make a mistake. Now that's a whole different bridge. I'm not going 70, 80 miles an hour over that bridge. I'm going 20 miles, 30 miles, maybe 15 miles. And I'm going to hug that side, just like a good donkey hugs the side as they're going up and down the Grand Canyon, because I want to know every single edge and ledge. I want to know where it is at every moment. No, the doctrines are there to help carry you across the bridges of life so you can be on mission with freedom and with faith and with favor and flair but you and that the point of the bridge is not the guardrails. The point of the bridge is to get you across, to get to your mission. And so we need guardrails. We need the scaffolding on the bridges, but we don't go over the bridge just looking at, oh, look at how beautiful that guardrail is. Look how beautiful that scaffolding is. No, we're there to proceed where God is calling us to go. Another one, a trellis. Grapes. Jesus, one of the favorite, I'm the vine, you're the branches. We share the same life. The vine and the branches share the same life. But the point, the way in which you get good vines and good branches is you got to have scaffolding. The scaffolding that holds up the vine so they can produce the best branches, so they can produce the best grapes. Now, we can argue about whether wood scaffolding is better than wire scaffolding, whether vertical scaffolding is better than horizontal scaffolding. You go to different places in the world, they have different kinds of scaffolding, and each one is committed to its form of scaffolding. Others have the vines themselves that provide the scaffolding. So the vines themselves do the scaffolding, but it takes centuries for it to really work well. But you don't get any nourishment. You don't get any food from the scaffolding. And you don't go and say, oh, look how beautiful that scaffolding is. And you don't worship the scaffolding and talk about the scaffolding. No, the scaffolding there is to hold up the vine so they can produce the best branches, so they can yield the most succulent and juicy grapes. Recipes are like doctrines and traditions, and rituals, they're like recipes. A world that is hungry for food needs not recipes, but repast. It needs the bread of life and the cup of salvation, but you can't get there without the recipes. Now, you improvise on the recipes that help you, but you need the recipes. I could go on and on. You get the picture. The whole purpose of all of these examples is that there is the ultimate content of theology. In fact, the ultimate doctrine of Christian theology, if you will, is Jesus. It's all about Jesus, who's the bread of life and the cup of salvation. So everything exists to lift him up and to make him the bread of life and the cup of salvation, the vine and the wine. Now, I don't want to dilute or dispute doctrine. I want to route and reconstitute it deeper, where all doctrine begins and ends, which is this apostolic acuteness of relationship that Jesus himself introduces in this wedding metaphor, which became the dominant metaphor, the paradigmatic metaphor for the church. We dismiss and diminish doctrine at our peril. But Christianity, at its base, the way, is a matrix of relationships before it's a system of doctrines. We undermine and marginalize doctrine at our peril. For doctrine clarifies, it guards rails us, it corrects us, it consoles us, it deepens and broadens and paves the true path of discipleship. But the life of faith doesn't end in doctrine. It doesn't end in creeds. The life of faith ends in the unfailing, everlasting arms of love, leaning on those everlasting arms, the arms of Jesus. I wrote a book a while back on just trying to get the church to not diminish or dismiss doctrine, but to put it in its proper perspective. And so I called it 11 indispensable relationships you can't be without. In other words, rethinking the life of faith. What does it mean to be a disciple? It doesn't mean following these doctrinal formulations and these creedal principles, or even these ritual formulations. It means being on the way and having this matrix of relationships. So I suggested everybody in their life needs a Nathan. You know, that person will stick a bony finger in your face and say, you, the one God is called to greatness and to do great things, but you the one that is really messed up. And so we need an editor. Who's your editor? Do you have a Nathan in your life? Somebody's going to make your life story better. Not critiquing it to tear you down, but to platform your voice and build up your voice and make it stronger and more powerful for God and the gospel. Who's your Nathan? Do you have a Jonathan? Jesus had a best friend. 61% of clergy say they have no best friend. Are we better than Jesus? Are you kidding me? Even Jesus needed a best friend. So who's your Jonathan? Who's your Lazarus? Who's your Mary and Martha? Jesus' best friends. Everyone needs a Jethro. Think about it. I mean, Moses was very content. And it was Jethro, his father-in-law, that had to kick him in the butt. Everybody needs a butt kicker. Get off your posterior and on your perpendicular and get out there and do something great for God. God is calling you. It's time you heard and listened to the call. So who's your Jethro? Who's your Timothy? Everybody needs to be mentoring a successor. Who's going to take your place? Who are you raising up to be you? Who's your protege? Everybody needs a Barnabas. Barnabas was known for being an encourager. Who's your Barnabas? Who's your Barnabas? And by the way, every one of these is a double-edged sword, because you need a Barnabas, but you need to be a Barnabas to somebody else. So who are you in a Barnabas relationship with? Who are you giving daily Barnabas blasts to encourage them and lift up their arms for ministry? Who's your Peter Paul? Everybody needs a Yoda. Everybody needs one of the great theological minds, and that you can push back and argue with and deepen your faith. Who's your Peter Paul? Who's your Deborah? Every one of the most important people in your life is somebody that will come to you and say, I've got your back covered. I've got your back covered. Nobody has made a difference for God in history without somebody on the margins, on the periphery, who said, you can go. I've got your back. Who do you have? Who are you being a Deborah to? Who's your Deborah? Everybody needs a Zacchaeus. Remember that wee little man was he? He was totally despised. He was totally rejected. Nobody wanted to be around him. Everybody, and it didn't make Jesus look good by going to his house. But who are the rejects that you are bringing close to you? The people that nobody can understand. Why are you a friend with that person? And yet you feel a special calling to be in that person's life. Who's your Zacchaeus? Everybody needs a Rhoda. Who's your little ones? Jesus said, let the little ones come to me. Are you letting the little ones come to you? Who are you in relationship with? The little ones. Remember Peter knocking at the door? And they're all praying for Peter's release, and Rhoda's, this little girl, goes, he's here at the door. Oh, Rhoda, just stop fooling around. And finally, Peter appears, and their prayers have been answered. They're having so much fun praying that they didn't really trust in the power of their own prayer to have it answered. And Rhoda's the one that had to wake them up and say, your prayers are answered. There's Peter. So who are the Rhodas of your life? Are you in a little demographic? Have you circled the wagons in one little demographic circle? Who is your, and this is a place, where is your Jerusalem? Jesus cried over a place. He cried over a person. He cried over a place. I think he had two special places. I'm sure he had more, but Jerusalem and Bethany. Do you have a special place where you can just hang out and let it be? And so, again, we can think doctrinally, and I thank God for doctrine, and I don't want to dismiss doctrine. But even more important, the end of our faith is not, Lord, I present to you my doctrinal faithfulness. Lord, I present to you my life and the relationships of my life and the relationships I impacted with my life. As we think of Jesus as the truth, who calls us into what? Relationship. Believe on me. Follow me. Jesus is the content of all our doctrine.